she murmured. "You deserve someone younger." But the cowboy sat by her bed, Western love story. The town of Silver Ridge was small, quiet, and surrounded by wide-open land. Dusty roads ran between wooden buildings, and every evening the sky turned golden as the sun slowly disappeared behind the hills. People in Silver Ridge lived simple lives. Ranchers worked long days with their cattle. Shopkeepers greeted the same familiar faces every morning, and children ran along the streets after school. Among the many ranchers in town, there was one cowboy who was known for his calm nature. His name was Daniel Hayes. Daniel was not the loud type. He did not spend much time in the busy saloon or join the loud laughter of the evening crowds. Instead, he preferred quiet rides across the prairie and peaceful moments watching the sunset. Most people in Silver Ridge respected him because he worked hard and treated everyone with kindness. He helped neighbors when they needed it, fixed broken fences without asking for anything in return, and always greeted people with a warm smile. But there was something else about Daniel that many people noticed. Every evening, after finishing his ranch work, Daniel rode his horse slowly toward the town clinic. At first, people did not think much about it. They assumed he was just checking on someone who was sick. But as the days passed, the townsfolk began to realize that Daniel visited the same person every day. Her name was Margaret Collins. Margaret had been the town's schoolteacher for many years. Nearly every adult in Silver Ridge had once sat in her small classroom when they were children. She was known for her gentle voice, patient teaching, and warm heart. She believed every child in town could grow into something good if they only had someone who believed in them. Margaret lived alone in a small house near the school. Her life had always been simple: books, teaching, and helping the children of Silver Ridge learn about the world beyond the dusty roads. But time had quietly changed things. Margaret was no longer young. Her hair had turned soft silver, and her steps had become slower with each passing year. Still, she continued teaching until one cold winter morning when she suddenly fell ill. The town doctor decided she needed a rest at the small clinic above the general store, so he could watch over her. The news spread quickly through Silver Ridge. Many people visited Margaret during the first few days. Former students brought flowers. Parents stopped by to thank her for everything she had done for their children. But after a while, life in town returned to normal. People became busy again. Visitors slowly stopped coming, except for one person. Every evening, just before sunset, Daniel Hayes arrived at the clinic. He never made a big entrance. He would quietly tie his horse outside, remove his hat, and walk up the wooden stairs to Margaret's room. Sometimes he brought fresh wildflowers from the prairie. Sometimes he carried a small basket with fruit or warm bread from the bakery. And sometimes he brought nothing at all. He would simply sit beside her bed. The room was peaceful and filled with soft evening light from the window. Margaret often rested quietly while Daniel sat nearby in a wooden chair. He did not speak much. He never wanted to disturb her rest. Instead, he would read a book quietly or look out the window at the quiet town below. Margaret noticed this after a few days. At first, she thought Daniel was only visiting because he was being polite. Silver Ridge was a small town, and people often looked after one another. But Daniel kept coming back, day after day. Even when the weather became cold and strong winds moved across the plains, the cowboys still arrived at the clinic every evening. One night, Margaret finally opened her eyes while he was sitting beside her. The room was quiet except for the gentle sound of the wind outside. Daniel was placing a small jar of wildflowers on the table beside her bed. Margaret watched him for a moment before speaking softly. "Daniel, you don't have to come here every day." Her voice was weak but kind. Daniel paused for a moment. Then he looked at her with a calm smile. "I know," he said gently. Margaret studied his face with quiet curiosity. "You must be tired after working all day at the ranch," she continued. "You should be resting, not sitting here with an old teacher." Daniel shook his head slowly. "It's no trouble," he replied. Margaret looked at the flowers he had brought. Their bright colors filled the small room with life. For a moment, she did not say anything. She wondered why this quiet cowboy kept returning every evening when everyone else had slowly stopped visiting. Outside the window, the sun was slowly setting over Silver Ridge. The golden light filled the room as Daniel moved his chair closer to the bed so Margaret could see the sunset. Neither of them spoke. But in that quiet moment, Margaret began to realize something. The cowboy was not coming out of simple kindness. He was coming because he truly cared. The next morning in Silver Ridge was quiet and cool. A soft wind moved through the streets, carrying the smell of fresh bread from the bakery and the sound of horses walking along the dusty road. Inside the small clinic above the general store, Margaret Collins was slowly waking up. Sunlight slipped through the window and gently filled the room. For a moment, Margaret simply watched the light on the wooden floor. Her body still felt weak, but she could tell she was a little stronger than before. The town doctor had said rest was the best medicine. But Margaret's thoughts were not on medicine. They were on Daniel Hayes. The quiet cowboy had come to see her every evening for nearly 2 weeks now, no matter how cold the wind became or how long his workday was. Daniel always arrived just before sunset. Margaret did not fully understand why. Many people in town respected her as a teacher, but she never expected anyone to give up their time like that, especially not Daniel. Later that afternoon, the town doctor visited her room. He checked her temperature, listened to her breathing, and nodded with quiet satisfaction. "You're getting stronger, Miss Collins," he said kindly. "If you keep resting like this, you should be back on your feet soon." Margaret smiled softly. "That is good to hear, doctor." Before leaving the room, the doctor looked toward the small table near the window. A colorful collection of wildflowers filled several jars. "Well," the doctor said with a small smile, "someone certainly wants to brighten this room." Margaret followed his gaze. She knew exactly who had brought those flowers. The doctor chuckled quietly. That cowboy must have walked half the prairie by now. Margaret felt a small warmth in her chest, but she simply nodded and said nothing. As evening slowly arrived, the sky over Silver Ridge began turning orange and pink. Margaret was sitting up in her bed when she heard the familiar sound of boots on the wooden stairs outside the clinic. A moment later, the door opened gently. Daniel Hayes stepped inside. He removed his hat as usual and gave her a calm, friendly smile. "Good evening, Miss Collins." Margaret smiled back. "Good evening, Daniel." This time, Daniel carried a small cloth bag. He walked to the table and placed it beside the flowers. "What's that?" Margaret asked. "Fresh apples," Daniel said. "Mrs. Parker at the market said they might help bring your strength back." Margaret laughed softly. "Well, then I suppose I must eat them." Daniel pulled the wooden chair closer to her bed and sat down. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. Outside the window, the town moved slowly through another peaceful evening. A wagon rolled down the street, and somewhere in the distance children were laughing as they ran home for supper. Margaret watched Daniel quietly. There was something peaceful about him. Even when he said nothing, his presence made the room feel less lonely. Finally, she decided to ask the question that had been in her mind for days. "Daniel," she said gently. He looked up. "Yes, ma'am." Margaret hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Why do you keep coming here?" Daniel did not answer right away. Instead, he leaned back slightly in his chair and looked out the window toward the setting sun. The sky had turned deep gold. Margaret waited patiently. Finally, Daniel spoke. "Well," he said slowly, "I suppose there are a few reasons." Margaret raised an eyebrow with quiet curiosity. "Oh!" Daniel smiled faintly. "You might not remember," he continued, "but many years ago, when I first came to Silver Ridge, I wasn't very good at reading." Margaret listened carefully. "I was just a young ranch hand back then," Daniel said. "Most folks thought I wasn't much good with books." Margaret's expression softened. "But you didn't think that," Daniel added. He looked back at her. "You stayed after school one evening and helped me read through a whole story. Took nearly 2 hours." Margaret slowly remembered. A shy young ranch boy sitting in the classroom long after the other children had gone home. "You told me something that day," Daniel continued. Margaret tilted her head. "What did I say?" Daniel chuckled softly. "You said learning takes time, but anyone who keeps trying will get there eventually." Margaret smiled warmly. "That sounds like something I would say." Daniel nodded. "Well, I never forgot it." The room grew quiet again. Margaret looked down at the flowers beside her bed. "So you visit me every day because I helped you read one story?" she asked gently. Daniel smiled. "Not just that." Margaret looked back at him. Daniel paused for a moment before answering. "Because you believed in me when I didn't believe in myself." Margaret felt something deep in her heart. For the first time since she became ill, she realized something important. Daniel's visits were not just kindness. They came from something much deeper. Outside the window, the sun slowly disappeared behind the hills. The room filled with soft evening shadows. Margaret looked at the quiet cowboys sitting beside her bed, and in that moment, she understood that this simple routine, this quiet cowboy arriving every evening, was slowly becoming the most meaningful part of her day. But there were still many words left unsaid between them, and neither of them yet knew how important those words would soon become. Spring slowly began to arrive in Silver Ridge. The cold winter winds were fading, and the prairie around the town was starting to turn green again. Small yellow flowers appeared between the grass, and the air felt warmer with every passing day. Inside the small clinic above the general store, Margaret Collins was getting stronger. She could now sit beside the window for longer hours, watching the quiet life of the town below. Wagons passed along the dusty road. Ranchers greeted each other outside the store, and children walked home from school carrying their books. But every evening, just as the sun began to set, Margaret waited for the same familiar sound, boots on the wooden stairs. And just as always, the door would open gently. Daniel Hayes would step inside. His visits had now become part of her daily routine. Sometimes he brought fresh flowers, sometimes apples or warm bread, but often he simply brought something even more valuable, his quiet company. That evening, Margaret was already sitting by the window when Daniel arrived. "Good evening, Miss Collins," he said with a warm smile. "Good evening, Daniel," she replied. He placed his hat on the table and pulled the wooden chair beside her. Outside, the sky was glowing with soft orange light. Margaret watched the sunset for a moment before speaking. "I walked a little today," she said proudly. Daniel looked pleasantly surprised. "That's good news." "The doctor said I may be able to leave the clinic soon," Margaret added. Daniel nodded slowly. "That will make the town happy." Margaret studied his face carefully. "But I wonder if it will make you happy." Daniel looked at her with curiosity. "What do you mean?" Margaret smiled gently. "Well, if I leave the clinic, you won't have a reason to visit every evening." Daniel chuckled softly. "I think I can still find reasons." Margaret laughed quietly, but after a moment her expression became thoughtful. There was something she had been thinking about for several days now, something she felt she needed to say. "Daniel," she said softly. He turned toward her. "Yes, ma'am." Margaret looked out the window before speaking again. "You are a good man." Daniel said nothing. "And you are still young," she continued. "You have many years ahead of you." Daniel remained quiet, listening carefully. Margaret took a slow breath. "You should be spending your evenings building a future," she said gently, "not sitting beside the bed of an old teacher." Daniel looked down at his hands for a moment. Margaret continued speaking, her voice calm but honest. "There are many wonderful young women in Silver Ridge," she said. "Women who could give you a full life." For a few seconds, the room became very quiet. The soft wind outside brushed against the window. Finally, Margaret spoke the words that had been resting in her heart. "Daniel, you deserve someone younger." Her voice was soft, almost like a whisper. Daniel did not answer right away. He leaned back in his chair and looked out toward the wide prairie beyond the town. The golden sunset was spreading across the horizon. For a moment, Margaret wondered if she had said something wrong. Then Daniel slowly spoke. "Miss Collins," he said gently. Margaret turned toward him. "You once told me something in that classroom many years ago," he continued. Margaret waited quietly. Daniel smiled slightly. "You said that the most important thing in life is not how fast someone moves forward, but who walks beside them along the way." Margaret's eyes softened as she remembered those words. Daniel looked back at her. "I've ridden across a lot of land over the years," he said calmly. "Met many people, seen many towns." He paused for a moment. "But I've never met anyone who cared for others the way you do." Margaret felt her heart grow warm. Daniel continued. "You helped children learn to read. You gave them confidence. You helped them believe they could become something good. He looked around the quiet room. This town is full of people who are better because of you. Margaret blinked slowly, touched by his words. But Daniel, she said softly, that does not change the truth. What truth? He asked. Margaret looked down at her hands. That I am much older than you. Daniel smiled kindly. Age is just a number written on paper, he replied. Margaret looked at him with surprise. Daniel leaned forward slightly. What matters more is the person someone chooses to spend their time with. The room fell quiet again. Margaret looked out at the fading sunset. For the first time, she felt something she had not expected. Hope. Daniel picked up the jar of flowers from the table and moved it closer to the window. Besides, he said lightly, I happen to enjoy these evenings. Margaret smiled softly. As the last light of the sun faded behind the hills of Silver Ridge, the quiet cowboy and the gentle teacher sat side by side. Neither of them fully understood where this path might lead. But one thing had become clear. Daniel Hayes was not sitting beside her bed out of kindness. He was sitting there because his heart had already made its choice. Spring fully arrived in Silver Ridge. The prairie outside the town was covered with fresh green grass and small wildflowers. The air felt warmer, and the town looked brighter after the long winter. Inside the clinic, Margaret Collins was finally strong enough to leave. On the morning the doctor gave her the good news, the whole town seemed happy. Many people came to visit her room one last time before she returned home. Former students brought flowers. Parents came to thank her again for teaching their children. Even the baker sent a small basket of warm bread for her journey back. But Margaret noticed something. Among all the visitors, there was one person she quietly looked for, Daniel Hayes. That afternoon, as the sun climbed high above Silver Ridge, Margaret slowly packed a few things she had in the clinic. Her books were tied together with a small ribbon, and the jars of wildflowers stood neatly on the table. Just as she finished preparing to leave, she heard a familiar sound. Boots on the wooden stairs. A moment later, the door opened gently. Daniel stepped inside, holding his hat in his hand. Good afternoon, Miss Collins, he said with a warm smile. Margaret smiled back. Good afternoon, Daniel. He looked around the room and noticed the packed books and empty shelves. So the doctor has finally set you free, he said with a small laugh. Margaret nodded. It seemed so. Daniel walked toward the window and looked outside for a moment. Well, he said, then we should not keep you waiting. Margaret looked curious. Waiting for what? Daniel turned and pointed toward the street. Margaret slowly walked to the window. Outside, a small wagon stood near the clinic stairs. A calm brown horse waited patiently, and the wagon bed was filled with soft blankets. Margaret looked surprised. Daniel, what is this? Daniel placed his hat back on his head. Well, he said calmly, I thought you might need a ride home. Margaret smiled warmly. You didn't have to do that. Daniel shrugged lightly. I wanted to. A few minutes later, Margaret carefully walked down the wooden stairs of the clinic for the first time in weeks. Daniel stayed beside her to make sure she did not lose her balance. The warm spring air greeted her face. She took a deep breath. It feels good to be outside again, she said. Daniel helped her into the wagon, making sure the blankets were comfortable. Soon the horse began walking slowly down the dusty road. Margaret expected Daniel to take her directly back to her small house near the school. But after a few minutes, she noticed something unusual. They were heading away from the center of town. Margaret looked around with curiosity. Daniel, she said gently, I think you missed the road to my house. Daniel smiled slightly but said nothing. The wagon continued moving toward the open prairie. Soon the buildings of Silver Ridge were behind them. The land opened wide around them, stretching toward the distant hills. Wildflowers covered the ground like tiny pieces of sunlight. Finally, Daniel guided the wagon to stop near a small hill. He helped Margaret step down carefully. What is this place? She asked. Daniel pointed toward the horizon. This is where I come most evenings after work, he said. Margaret looked around in wonder. The view was beautiful. The prairie stretched endlessly, and the sky above seemed larger than she had ever noticed before. They sat together on the wagon bench. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind moved softly through the grass. Then Margaret turned to Daniel. You brought me all the way out here just to see the prairie? Daniel chuckled quietly. Well, partly. Margaret raised an eyebrow with curiosity. And the other reason? Daniel looked toward the setting sun. I wanted to show you something important. Margaret followed his gaze. The sun was slowly lowering behind the hills, painting the sky with deep orange and golden colors. Daniel spoke softly. Out here, things move slower. Margaret listened quietly. There are no busy streets, he continued. No noisy crowds. He looked at her. Just time and the people you choose to share it with. Margaret understood what he was saying. Her heart felt calm in a way she had not felt in many years. You really believe age does not matter? She asked gently. Daniel smiled. I believe kindness matters. He paused. And patience. Margaret looked at the peaceful prairie around them. And love, she asked softly. Daniel's smile grew warmer. That too. The sun slowly disappeared behind the hills. For a long time, they simply watched the sky change colors. The quiet cowboy and the gentle teacher sat side by side, surrounded by the wide beauty of the prairie. Back in Silver Ridge, people would soon notice something new. Many evenings, just before sunset, a small wagon could be seen traveling slowly toward the hills. And inside that wagon sat Daniel Hayes and Margaret Collins, sharing peaceful moments together. Their story was not loud or dramatic, but was strong, patient, and real, just like the prairie itself. And in the quiet town of Silver Ridge, people slowly began to understand something beautiful. Love does not always arrive in a hurry.